Madness bracket, the tightest race was between Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, which lost by a mere 3 votes to crown him with many crowns. The victor, though, with the greatest margin was It Is Well With My Soul, which won a decisive victory over Rock of Ages. When we reviewed the results this week, Matt worried for a moment that it might have been the overview he wrote for Rock of Ages was kind of a downer. Which may be, but while few of us have faced the kind of tragedy that Horatio Spafford faced, the writer of It Is Well With My Soul, all of us know the kind of exhaustion and weariness that comes when it seems that tragedy follows unending tragedy. When we face like the pile-on of bad news on top of bad news. Good Lord, do we get weary. Yet Spafford's invitation to trust and hope that it is well with my soul speaks of the heart's longing to be open, wide open, to the peace of God that sustains us in the midst of our weariness, and our call to share that peace with one another. In today's readings, we see that longing when the servant admits both their weariness and their trust in God, and God responds with an enlarged mission, an invitation to wholehearted living. Now, the book of Isaiah records 4 servant songs. Last week we read from the first servant song. This week we read from the second. The third and the fourth come up late in the season of Lent. Classically, Christians have felt that Isaiah's words in these songs point to Jesus. And the classical Jewish interpretation is that the servant is Israel, the whole people, the whole nation. But because the servant's mission is to Israel, which we see in verse 5 and again in verse 6, some scholars have wondered if the servant is like a specific historical person that Isaiah is speaking about. But no one has really figured out who that could be. It's impossible for us to know the exact identity of the servant, but we do know some important details about them. Most importantly, whoever they are like the Blues Brothers, and they're on a mission from God. And that mission is one of healing and liberation. The servant's mission is to gather Israel from where they have been scattered. The exiles sent the people to the capital city of Babylon, also called Babylon, but they also sent them to other places in the sprawling empire. Some Jews remained in the ruined city of Jerusalem and in other bigger cities, towns, and villages. And some were in rural and remote areas, which remained untouched by the violence, but also completely cut off from one another as a result. The servant is called to gather all these people together, to reunite them as a people again, to bring them home. It's a hopeful mission, but at the point that we read, the exile is going on 50 years. And history tells us that it is nearly over, that Cyrus the Great of Persia is rising and he will conquer Babylon and send the exiles home. But from this place in the story, no one knows that. And the servant's exhaustion and discouragement is on display midway through the passage. The servant says, "But I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity." The servant has been called to gather the scattered people of Israel and bring them home, but the exile has already been a lifetime. Children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren have been born far from home. Grandparents have been buried in this foreign soil. Loss has piled on to loss, and it hasn't been easy. Normal, some kind of day-to-day safety has never really arrived for the exiles. Esther and Daniel recount stories of foiled genocides and near murder of Jews who dare to worship God or challenge the empire's authority. The people are weary, and the servant is worn out. And we know that 50 years is just like a blip in human history, yet it doesn't take much to imagine what the days looked like on the ground from the street view of the exiles, or those picking up the rubble of Jerusalem, or the ones spared but scared in some remote rural Judean village. It doesn't take much to imagine the flickers of hope that rarely shimmer in between days of discouragement, the weariness that settles into your bones as a week becomes a month, becomes a year, a decade, a lifetime. It doesn't take much to imagine how you try to go on to find something that looks like normalcy, even as your ears are always tuned for some word of change, even as your heart always knows the direction to turn toward home. Which is ultimately what the servant admits, that even when it makes more sense to give up, to be all like, well, this is my life now, even then the servant says, my cause, my reward are with my God. I think this really is a prayer, and maybe I think it's a prayer because it sounds an awful lot like what I've been praying as of late. I pray about how I write letters, and I make phone calls, and I send money, and I try to just put so much good out into the world, and still I am weary, so weary. I pray about how every day it seems that there is just more to feel hopeless about, and more to feel discouraged by. And yet, like the psalmist, like Isaiah, I wait for the Lord. I pray that my cause is with God. And maybe I think that this is a prayer because God answers. And God says, this thing that you've been doing to gather and restore my people, this isn't all that I'm calling you to do. God says to the servant, no, I want you to bring the message of that light and that salvation to everyone, to all the nations. Walt Brueggemann says that we should consider light and salvation as synonyms, both of them referring to the full offer of well-being as intended by the Creator. He says, light is the antithesis of darkness, disorder, and chaos, and salvation is the counter to oppression, exploitation, and despair. But what strikes me most from God's response is that God seems to think that this expanded mission is somehow the answer to the servant's weariness. And I don't know about you, but when I pray, sometimes I want to hold a little microphone and give it a tap and be like, is this thing on? Kind of what I did earlier. This happens less often when I feel that my prayers have gone unanswered, and more often when I feel that growing sense of call leading me in directions I may not prefer to go. Ahem? God? I said. I said I'm tired. I said I'm spent, and you want me to do what? And most of the time, God very happily says, yep. I heard you. Let's get going, which is very annoying. Sometimes God blessedly says, let's have a snack and a nap, but then let's get going. And yet, the poet David Whyte wrote a book about work. It's a kind of a philosophical memoir justifying his decision to be a poet, to give up a more traditional career path and make his work and life about poetry. And one evening, as he's discerning this, he's weary, and he welcomes a friend, a monk who's also named David. And the poet asks the monk, tell me about exhaustion. And as an explanation, the monk says, you know that the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. And the poet, so worn out, repeats what's been said, but doesn't seem to gain any understanding, and then says, what is it then? And the monk says, the antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. God says to the servant, it is too light a thing for you to be called to worry about these things. You are called to witness to them, to be a part of the work that I am doing, to be a light to the nations, to the whole world. It's a call to wholeheartedness. And isn't there a crumb of truth there? Beloved, the news comes in fast and hot every day, and heartbreak with it. Bad news piles upon bad news, and it does weary us. Each of us is pulled in 1,000 different directions every day as we live out our callings: parent, child, employee, friend, community member, voter, advocate, neighbor. And yet, we are called forward, called to be present, called to do and be with our whole hearts wide open, shining God's light into the world.